Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Trillium Provincial Demonstration School webinar with today's topic being Understanding Learning Disabilities. This is today's agenda. We're first going to talk about the learning disability profile in terms of a diagnosis versus an identification. Then we're going to talk about learning disabilities within the classroom, both academically, behaviorally, and socially. Throughout the presentation, we'll be talking about, processing weaknesses and various classroom strategies that we can use to help support students with learning disabilities. So by way of introductions, my name is Shannon Scullion. I'm one of 4 people that work in the Resource Services Department at Trillium Provincial Demonstration School. My current role at Trillium is to support educators and school boards across our province for students that have severe learning disabilities and ADHD. My background is completely in special education. I have over 20 years experience in special education. I've worked in a number of roles, including a seconded teacher to Trillium Provincial Demonstration School. I've worked in self-contained classrooms for students with learning disabilities and ADHD, as well as behavior. And as well, I've had the opportunity to work at 2 Ontario school boards as a psychoeducational consultant. So I'm hoping that I can bring to you today some good insight in terms of understanding learning disabilities. I'm joined today by my colleague, Emily Tack, who works as our assistant technology advisor for our school. So I'll give Emily a chance to say hello.
Perfect. Thanks, Shannon. So yes, my name is Emily Tack, and I'm currently the Assistive Technology Advisor at Trillium. I'm also an Ontario certified teacher. I've worked in Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board and Halton Catholic District School Board. So my role right now at Trillium is to primarily help students in their technology and to teach them different assistive technology and tech programs that might support their learning needs throughout the year. So I also have a background in special education, assessment and evaluation, and teaching LLs. So I'm hoping to bring those expertise that I've gained in all my other roles to our students.
Thank you, Emily. I'm not sure. It sounds like we might be having some tech issues.
Back to you, Shannon.
Yeah, so it just sounded a bit laggy. So I don't know if you're hearing me okay. Hopefully it's okay. I will continue. So if you can just, okay, great.
So
all right, so maybe if you, maybe we're just getting some feedback. So maybe if you turn off your volume, that might work. Okay. So just a couple Zoom features before we get started. So in order to allow you to focus simply on the slides, I'll be turning the camera feed off in a second. We've enabled both the chat and the Q&A room. So Emily's going to assist me by monitoring those, and I'll stop periodically for any questions. And please feel free, Emily, to interrupt me at any time if there's something important that I need to stop for. We are recording the session today, so following the session, we will email you the slide deck and the recording. If by chance we go over our 45-minute webinar and you have to leave early, or if you have to leave early for another reason, please feel free to do so, and the slide deck will be sent to you. Okay. Okay, so I'm turning off my camera feed and we'll begin the presentation. So we're going to talk about, start by talking about the areas of exceptionality. So the Education Act identifies five categories of exceptionalities for exceptional students within our board. I've included a link at the bottom of this slide to the Special Education Guide in Ontario, and on page 14, it talks about the different exceptionalities and provides definitions. So these are broad categories that are designed to address the wide range of conditions that may affect a student's ability to learn. These are meant to be inclusive of all medical conditions, whether the condition is diagnosed or not, and all medical conditions that can impact learning. A student may present with different learning needs in many ways in the school setting, as we know, and may be identified as exceptional in one of these 5 categories. So behavior, communication, intellectual, physical, and multiple. The determining factor for the provision of special education programs is not any specific diagnosed or undiagnosed medical condition, but rather it's the need of the individual student that's based on individual assessment, strengths, and needs. For example, if we have a student that is diagnosed with ADHD and is managing the symptoms of that diagnosis very well in the educational system, then there's no need to provide an identification. Conversely, if that same student with ADHD is presenting with many academic needs or behavior needs in the system, then we may consider one of our identification categories for that student. We do not have a category for ADHD, but often ADHD kids will have behaviors if they are severe and intense and sort of exist for long enough, they may meet behavior criteria within a board. Often there's comorbid or dual diagnosis with ADHD, so perhaps they would be identified under the communication realm of a learning disability if we had the data to support those. Along those same lines of undiagnosed and diagnosed conditions, let's say a student presents very much like they are ADHD in terms of their behavior and their learning, but does not have this diagnosis. The board does not need to have this diagnosis in order to identify them as an exceptional student, as long as the board has their own assessment data and can make a case that they fit one of the categories of exceptionality, then that board, they can move ahead without an official diagnosis to identify them as exceptional. I also wanted to note that underneath communications learning disability, the main way that it's defined, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail as we go through, is the ministry's definition, which is provided in the PPM, the Program Policy Memorandum number 8, which was revised in 2014, which talks about the identification and program planning for students with learning disabilities. So it's, even though it's defined in this document, Special Education in Ontario, it's defined in greater detail. And it's the one that's widely used across most boards in that PPM 8. There is a link to it in the upcoming slides. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between an identification versus a diagnosis. And I know that this causes some areas of confusion for some people working in the field of special education. So with respect to the definition of a learning disabilities, the waters can be a little bit muddy and things can sometimes be a bit confusing. And the reason that this is essentially the way that we define a learning disability, and that the fact that it can be done by sort of 2 separate areas of professionals. So firstly, by educational professionals, and then secondly, by regulated health professionals. So within education, we use the Ministry of Education document. On page 15, it describes what a learning disability is. We use PPM 8, and if you press on all of these, there is a link to each definition. So these, and then there's the LDAO definition. There's the Learning Disabilities Association of Canada definition, and at Trillium Provincial Demonstration School, I just put that in there. We all use the same definition. So within education, if you work across school boards, you can pretty much see people following kind of what's in PPM8 because it's quite specific and tells us really what we're looking for. The second area of professionals that look at defining and identifying learning disabilities are those in the clinical field. So those are our regulated health professionals, such as psychologists or pediatricians that may diagnose a learning disability. And they generally follow what's called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a manual for assessment and diagnosis of mental disorders, and it's used by regulated health professionals. So within the DSM-5, we do have the diagnosis criteria for a learning disability. In the DSM-5, it's called a learning disorder. So that might be a little bit confusing, is just the language that they use. And sometimes in psych ed reports, you might see a coding or a number, such as 315.0, which means an impairment in reading. Then there's one for an impairment in writing and an impairment in math. So you may see it called a learning disorder. And there are fundamental differences between the criteria for identification, which is done in education, and the diagnosis, which is done clinically, of a learning disability. And the biggest difference being around processing weaknesses, with school boards and educational identification requiring the presence of processing weaknesses, where diagnostic criteria does not. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth around the educational piece and what we look for when we're identifying a learning disability. So what is a learning disability? So if we look at PPM8 and our ministry guidelines, and most professionals, whether it's clinical or educational, will follow sort of this guideline. So the most common criteria you'll see are and it's sort of a three-pronged approach. So if we're looking at, we have to look at the IQ, we have to look at the achievement or the academics, and we have to look at the processing areas. So when we're looking at IQ or intelligence, we're looking at average to broad average intelligence. We're going to go into this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. When we're looking at achievement or academics, we're looking at achievement that's inconsistent with where we would expect a child to be based on their intellectual ability. And we're looking at achievement only in the areas of reading, writing, and math. Generally, work habits and learning skills are also impacted, but we diagnose learning disabilities in these three areas: reading, writing, or math. For example, you can't have a diagnosed learning disability in, say, science or geography, okay? It has to be in reading, writing, or mathematics. So if we have delayed achievement or academics, we have to ask why. Why is that child not performing to their potential? And this is when we look at processing weaknesses. So psychological processes or processing weaknesses are the cause of the academic delay. So we're often looking for areas that impact the achievement. And we're looking for exclusions as well. So we're making sure when we're diagnosing a learning disability that it's not the result of something going on that's sort of some trauma in the student's life, or perhaps some lack of educational opportunity. We don't want to diagnose students who are cognitively and globally very low with a learning disability. Okay, so there you have to look at excluding a number of things in order to conclude that there for certain is a learning disability diagnosis. And if we—
Can I interrupt for a quick second?
Yes.
Just one note in the Q&A, someone just wrote that when you move your mouse, it brings up the bar that blocks out the slide. So just so you're mindful of that, just so none of your text or images are covered when you're hovering over your slide.
Oh, thank you. Okay, a little glitch. Thanks so much. Okay. The next slide. So you've probably heard the term dyslexia. So is it dyslexia? And the quick answer to that is yes. So historically, dyslexia has been around as sort of the first descriptor of what we typically think of as a reading disability, and those students that have sort of that visual perception problem underlying their reading challenges, reversals such as B and D and was for saw, so being transposing and reversing all of the numbers. So dyslexia is used widely still in the United States. It also does exist, these terms do exist within the DSM-5. However, in education, we generally do not use these terms. That's not to say that it's bad if they come up and if you do use it, but we just have more precise ways of defining what a learning disability is. Now, what we know from all of the research over the past 5 decades or so is that only a small percentage of students have dyslexia in terms of having an underlying processing deficit in that visual area. What we know now is that most reading disabilities are more commonly due to phonological processing difficulties, working memory problems, and general language processing problems. So there's more validated research and evidence today linking certain cognitive areas to reading disorders as opposed to that visual perception piece. But it does exist, and you may still hear this language today. So if we move forward, we talked about there being 3 big areas or 3 big look fors when diagnosing a learning disability. So I'm just going to break it down in the next couple of slides for you a little bit deeper. So if we look at that cognitive piece, when we pick up a psych ed assessment, we'll generally see, hopefully, a good solid measure of a child's cognitive or intellectual ability. The gold standard IQ test that's used widely across North America is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. It's in its 5th edition now, and it has essentially 5 main areas that it looks at. The first 3 bullets there, verbal reasoning, visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning, look at a child's ability to think, reason, problem solve, understand, and it does it all with words, and then it does it, the second 2, visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning, it does it with pictures and visual things. The working memory and processing speed are sort of like helper skills and abilities that allow us to work to our potential with efficiency and effectiveness. So what an examiner will do when they're administering the WISC is they'll look for the best measure of overall intelligence for a student. So whether they can base their overall intelligence on verbal reasoning, maybe on visual, spatial, it would be best if they could come up and use all 5 of those scales and come up with what we call a full scale IQ score. However, what we know with students with severe learning disabilities is that we get a lot of variability, a lot of spikiness and scatter within the profile. So we're often only reporting on one of these 5 areas, actually usually one of these 3 areas as the strongest area of potential. So basically what we do, let's say the visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning turn out to be our strongest areas. Then what we do, let's say they come out within an average range, and we're going to show this on a graph on the next slide. Then what we do is we look at the reading and the writing and the math, and if we have cognitive ability within the average range, we would expect academically that that child is performing to their potential. So let's say that they're not performing to their potential, perhaps that their reading and their writing is below where we would expect it to be based on their cognitive ability. We then need to move to the 3rd area and ask ourselves, why? Why is that child not able to work to their potential? And so then we look at psychological processes or areas of processing that are weak. And here's just a few examples. This by all means is not an exhaustive list, but examiners will generally look for two processing weaknesses that they can directly relate to the weakness academically. And in the next slide, I'm going to break this down a little bit more and look at it visually. Okay, so if we look here at these cognitive areas, we can see that the visual spatial scores are within a broad average range. So the average range is from the 25th to the 74th percentile, but examiners will sometimes stretch that out to around the 16th percentile in order to call one of the cognitive measures an average score. So we can look at the visual spatial at the 27th percentile and the fluid reasoning at the 18th percentile and say that that's a pretty good measure that this child has some average cognitive ability, broad average cognitive ability. So we would expect when we look at their reading, writing, and math scores that we would see those within this area here. But what we're seeing in this particular case is that the writing and the reading are discrepant or below what we would expect based on that broad average cognitive ability. So then we need to ask ourselves, why? Why is this child not performing to their potential in the areas of writing and reading? So then we're going to look for processing deficits that directly connect to it. So in this case, we have a phonological processing deficit at the 4th percentile and a verbal comprehension processing deficit at the 3rd percentile. Verbal comprehension is one of the big areas on the IQ test, and those areas can be used as processing weaknesses if they are below that cognitive potential. So this is sort of putting those three big look fors together in a visual graph for you. So in the next few slides, what we're going to do is have a look at the processing areas of weakness, so the psychological processes. What we know is that, sorry, I'm just sort of getting my notes here. Processing areas work together like pieces of an orchestra. So in order to function optimally, they have to rely on each other and work together. An example might be, let's say a student has their math facts pretty much committed to memory. So we know they have a good memory for math facts, but perhaps they have slow processing speed. Despite their good memory for math facts, if their processing speed is weak, then they won't be able to quickly recall those facts and do it in an automatic way. So they may not appear as efficient and as effective as they actually are, or as strong as they actually are. So here are a few examples of areas of processing weakness that a psychologist might look for when they're doing a psych ed assessment. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it's sort of the big areas that we see in educational or psych ed assessments within the school board. I'm going to point you to two documents that we use quite a bit up at Trillium in order to help us understand the various psychological processes and how to program for them. This one here on the left is a long version of this one on the right. So I'm just going to open up this one on the right. This is published by York Region District School Board. It's widely available on the internet with a quick Google search. There's also obviously links in the slide deck for you for both of these. It reads by column. So if we look at phonological processing, it gives you a definition of what phonological processing is. It gives you some signs that you might see in your classroom if a student has this difficulty. And the nice thing about this document is it provides you with all of the strategies in terms of instructional, environmental, and assessment strategies. So it's a really nice starting point, and it's got all of the areas of processing listed across the top. It's a really nice starting point when you're trying to get started with your LD student. And I think really knowing the areas of strength in terms of psychological processes and weaknesses for a student with a learning disability is key to programming and supporting them within our classrooms. What we're going to do in the next few slides is just take a look at some of these areas of processing weakness and talk about what they are in greater detail, look at some strategies and what it might look like in the classroom. Okay, we'll start first with language processing. So on the left is a definition of what language processing entails. This is essentially sort of the whole left side of our brain and our ability to understand spoken language, to think in words and use language to problem solve, to be able to understand and communicate, to express your thinking using words. And to understand what people are saying. So students that struggle with language processing in the classroom, they'll struggle to understand new lessons. They'll struggle to follow and comprehend oral instructions and questions. Problem solving and expressing understanding and thinking verbally and in writing will be challenging. Integrating information is challenging. So working with and understanding abstract or novel concepts will be really challenging for these students. They will struggle with reading comprehension and have difficulties with why-type questions. They'll have difficulty transferring what they learn in one subject area across to another subject area. Often if kids have weak language processing, sometimes, especially at Trillium, we'll see kids that have language processing around the second or third percentile. And if it is very, very low like that, often these kids will present as though they have an intellectual disability at times if the lesson or if the communication is too heavily language loaded. So the biggest things, and there's accommodations and strategies listed here, but the biggest things that we can keep in mind for students with language processing difficulties is just to slow things down, to repeat things, to make things as multisensory as possible, and to really do a lot of check-ins with their understanding to make sure that they understand what you're saying. Okay, next we're going to talk about nonverbal processing. This is one of the big areas measured on the IQ test as well that we talked about. And the IQ test, when it looks at nonverbal reasoning or processing, it looks at it in terms of visual spatial skills and fluid reasoning. And visual spatial, a nice way to think about this is the IKEA furniture analogy. So if you were to put all the pieces of a big piece of furniture from IKEA out on the floor, somebody that has strong visual spatial skills will be able to see how all those parts fit together to make a whole without even looking at those very unhelpful manuals sometimes. So this person will be able to visualize something that's not directly in front of them. They'll see how the pieces go together to create the whole. They'll be able to manipulate and move images in their mind in order to create the whole thing. So they easily visualize things. The second part of the IQ test that measures nonverbal processing or reasoning is called fluid reasoning. And this is more of a broad visual intelligence. It really looks at that abstract thinking. It requires the student to detect conceptual relationships between visual objects and use reasoning to identify and apply rules and generalize visual concepts. So students that have weaknesses in these visual areas in the classroom, so you might see kids that have problems with procedural learning or trial and error type problem solving. They'll have difficulty understanding charts and diagrams and maps and understanding the concept of quantity. Generalizing any kind of visual information will be challenging. Things involving construction projects, poster board presentations, so art projects will be challenging. Various concepts in math, graphing, geometry, patterning, volume area, subitizing, things like that would be very challenging for kids that have nonverbal processing weaknesses. Socially, these kids often struggle because they misread or misconstrue social cues, because we know that approximately 80% of communication is done nonverbally, and kids that have weaknesses with nonverbal skills really struggle socially. With reading, these are kids that are skipping lines, so they need trackers to help keep track with the lines of print. They struggle with directionality and sequencing. So these are your sort of historically those dyslexic students that mix up the B's and D's and transpose letters and words. Often these kids have difficulty navigating their environment. For example, starting grade 9, they may get lost easily. It may take them a little bit longer than neurotypical learners to learn how to navigate their environment and figure out where they are. Trouble driving, so often these kids have more accidents on the road because their visual spatial skills are much weaker, and they have difficulty navigating that visual field and understanding it. Okay, and there are a few recommendations there, and in service of time, we will go on. You can have a look at those. Another area of processing weakness that you'll see often reported on in psych ed assessments is working memory. One of the easiest ways to understanding working memory is to visualize it as a carpenter's workbench. The carpenter temporarily places tools and materials on the workbench as she builds new products. The workbench has a small size and only a few items can be placed on it at one time. So it is an immediate here and now type of memory. So there's only a small amount of space to store, a small amount of capacity, and it can only hold a few items at once. Often kids that have severe learning disabilities will have weaknesses in working memory that are quite severe. These weaknesses are found in, working memory is found in many tasks and used all day long at school. It can be used in classroom discussions. It can be used, for example, in math calculations. You're trying to hold on to information in your memory while you're, executing the steps. And it can be used a lot in written language and reading. It can be used in decoding a multisyllabic word when you're decoding a word and you get to the end and you forget what you said at the beginning of the word. So it's sort of that immediate here and now memory. And it really does have a big impact on a student's ability within the classroom when this is weak. Another big area that can be weak for students that have severe learning disabilities is processing speed. And I'm going to allow you a few seconds here to do this is called the Stroop test. You probably or may have seen this before, but if you can have a look at this and say the word, not the color, and that will give you an experience of what it's like for a processing speed weakness. Okay, so that simulation allows you to feel what it's like to process information slowly. So it's a lot of hard work for the student that has a processing speed weakness. It's very tiring, and it takes up a lot of mental energy. So despite how smart they are and cognitively how they may have so many strengths, if the processing speed is slow, it really does weigh heavily and slow things down and not allow them to work as efficiently as probably they are able to. The biggest strategies and accommodations are really just time and patience. So often, kids with processing speech weaknesses will have a difficult time articulating or getting out what they want to say. So really trying to avoid the urge to jump in and help them, just giving them time and lots of patience in terms of a way to really support this. And think of it too in terms of visual. So, always making sure that they have the notes on hand. Information is presented at a slower pace, giving them lots of wait time in terms of responding. Next, we're going to talk about memory. Now, memory is not a unifying construct. It can be a little bit confusing. Students can have exceptional memory skills in for some types of information and formats of presentation, and very poor memory skills for others. There's different kinds of memory, like semantic memory, episodic, procedural, automatic, emotional, like all various types of memory. A student could remember what they had on last week, but can't remember what you asked them to do a minute ago. So it just means that there's different types of memory that are at play. What you will see most commonly reported in psych ed assessments are the memories that are described on the left in the gray area. And as well, if we look up here on the top, it talks about input, coding and storage, and output or retrieval. So these are the big areas that are measured in psych ed assessments. And what they will do is they'll look at how a student inputs information, and they'll look at how a student inputs verbal information and how a student inputs visual information. They'll look at how that student codes or stores that verbal and visual information. And the test will also look at how the student outputs or retrieves that verbal or visual information. The psych ed assessments also look at the kind of information that's being inputted, coded, and outputted in terms of concrete information. So information that the student would find familiar and simple. And then information that's more abstract and can't be connected to anything that the student has seen or been exposed to before. So you can have a breakdown in any of these parts of memory. And this is important when you pick up a psych ed assessment, is to really look at these pieces and find out where the areas of breakdown are for the students so that you can provide appropriate support and strategies. If a student has difficulty, for example, at the input stage, but everything else is okay, and the input stage only for verbal information. So let's say 5 pieces of verbal information are presented. A student with deficits in this area would likely maybe just take in 2 of the 5 pieces. And the way they store it and output it will be fine. So they are able to output a response that takes into account 3 of the 5 pieces of information that went in. But you can see, because there was a breakdown at the input, what you get at the output will be compromised. So at the input stage with verbal information, a strategy for this student would just be making sure that all of the information goes in. So whether it's through repetition or a multisensory approach, so really trying to understand where the breakdown is so that you can provide the right support. Now, if we look at the next slide, we're looking at executive functioning. So often kids that have learning disabilities, and particularly those that have comorbidity, so that means like a second diagnosis of ADHD, which often goes hand in hand with the severe learning disability, generally underlying those challenges will be a deficit with executive functioning. And executive functioning is sort of that frontal lobe of our brains that does all the processing and organizing and allows us to do our thinking and guiding our behavior throughout the day. So if we think of that frontal lobe or that area of our brain as the conductor of the orchestrator, orchestra, I'm sorry. So they're the ones, so that frontal lobe is really in charge of our mental skills and allows us to make decisions and carry them out throughout our day. Generally, and especially with those students that have compromised executive functioning skills, this skill often does not mature until well after the age of 20, and then even later for those with severe learning disabilities. When you see it reported in a psych ed assessment, you'll see the examiner reporting on these areas. So inhibition, ability to monitor themselves, shifting their thinking, modulating emotions, and so on. So often kids with severe executive functioning weaknesses have problems in all of these areas. So what you want to do is connect these to the IEP and perhaps pick one or two areas per term that you can really work on trying to improve. We know that routines help make things better for kids that have executive functioning. So really trying to build the skill, and then those areas that you're not able to work on, because you certainly can't work on them all at one time, then you provide accommodations and sort of bypass strategies for those areas. So phonological processing is another area that's often found as a weakness for kids that have severe learning disabilities. So phonological deficits impact the ability to hear and manipulate individual sounds in language. And this is assessed in 3 ways in a psych ed assessment. So it looks at phonemic awareness, it looks at phonological memory, and also rapid naming. So students that have severe reading disabilities will generally have deficits in all 3 of these areas. And I know the students at Trillium generally have problems in all of these, and the nature of their learning, which makes the nature of their learning disabilities very severe. So when you're looking at providing support for a student that has phonological processing deficits, if you think of it in terms of a tiered approach to intervention, that will be useful. So the tier 1 being those kids that are struggling with reading and they need some screening, they need some extra support within the classroom. So sort of providing targeted classroom strategies for those students around building vocabulary, understanding, increasing their reading skills. Tier 2 would be with some more targeted, individualized instruction. So maybe some small group instruction, more intensive, using leveled language literacy programs, and perhaps the CERT in your school is pulling that student out and providing support a couple times a week in a targeted way. Our tier 3 intervention, we would use more structured language programs, and those are sort of the profile of student that we see at Trillium. So we're using structured language programs such as the Empower Reading Program, or the Wilson or Orton Gillingham, which is sort of the grandfather of the grandfather program of the structured language programs. It's used specifically for the students that are have the most severe learning disabilities. It requires, structured language programs require the teacher to be trained. They're very prescribed, incremental, and repetitive. They're all based on science and a lot of research to show how they directly improve reading skills. So depending on the nature and the severity of the learning disability will determine the type of approach to use in terms of those phonological processing deficits. And one last area that we're going to look at as we near the end of the presentation in terms of a psychological process is visual motor integration. So visual motor integration is the ability to coordinate our eyes and our hands to produce physical movement. So for example, to do an art project or to copy something from the board. In a psych ed assessment, it's measured sort of in 3 ways. Often the examiner will have the student try to discriminate visual symbols that are abstract. So kids that have this problem will be able to tell, for example, the difference between a B and a D when they're reading. This is also assessed through motor coordination. So looking at a child's precision and accuracy with a paper and pencil task. And then often what's the next step in the assessment is to integrate these skills and have the child produce sort of 3D images and see how they perceive the visual integration mixed with the motor coordination. So one of the easiest and biggest ways to support this is to really just give the student extra time. Do not, penalize them for messy writing. They'll be very disorganized in how they approach any kind of visual spatial task. Sort of relaxed time limits, and just a lot of time and patience, and providing bypass strategies, which is really good now with the text software packages that we have. Okay, so that's sort of wrapping up our section on looking at the processing weaknesses. And now we're just going to have a couple concluding slides as to what the student with a severe learning disability presents like in the classroom in terms of academically, behaviorally, and then socially and emotionally. So these students appear to often get it, but have difficulty despite understanding in those big areas of reading, writing, and math. Their vocabulary is often poor. Often the teacher is providing heavy accommodations in order to keep this student afloat. They demonstrate difficulties with literacy and numeracy across all subjects areas, difficulties with vocabulary and sound awareness, reversals, difficulty with fine and gross motor skills, and also with memory. So you can see with the learning disability that it's sort of pervasive, and you can see aspects of it across all areas of academics. In terms of behaviorally, so these kids, if you look right back to their kindergarten report cards, you can see challenges in terms of following direction and routine. They often have difficulties in classroom discussions, attention and concentration. They may be really bang on one day and then really struggling the next. Restless and fidgety. They really work better when somebody is close by or working with them. You'll see disorganization, a difficulty learning new concepts, especially those that are abstract. So things like time and money will be challenging. Gross and fine motor challenges. And then in terms of effort and motivation, so the student can be completely disengaged or very much overly committed and have sort of that perfectionistic, won't let it go response to things. And then what does that student with a severe learning disability look like socially and emotionally in the classroom? So pretty much there's pervasive difficulties that you can see right across the board, and it really impacts all areas of daily functioning. For example, a language deficit may impact conversational skills, which will impact ability to understand rules of the game at recess and may lead to social challenges. Visual skills may impact a child's ability to read social cues and navigate visual spaces. Working memory issues may make it hard to hold a conversation out on the playground and may impact them socially. It will make them have problems keeping up with plans and routines in the classroom. Socially, the student with a severe LD may appear less mature than their peers. They may lack age-appropriate skills, such as manners and turn-taking that you would think would be appropriate at certain ages. They may misread cues, such as a tone of the voice or subtleties in the language. In terms of friendships, often these kids lack friends or have challenges when they're trying to resolve conflicts and problem solve socially. In terms of mental health and emotional regulation, sometimes you'll see internalized behaviors such as anxiety and withdrawal or depression, or sometimes you'll see externalized behaviors. So sometimes the kids will have oppositional defiant disorder, anger, a lot of emotional dysregulation. So you can see that a child with severe learning disability really has pervasive challenges across all areas. And then lastly, just a few pointers on how to support your student with a learning disability in the classroom. So first and foremost, really look at the program and making sure that it is individualized for the student. So every student with a learning disability is unique and their profile is unique. So really taking the time to understand a student's profile of strengths and weaknesses, and pay close attention to those processing deficits when you're guiding your accommodations and your differentiation. Keep in mind that students with severe learning disabilities often have comorbid diagnoses such as ADHD or anxiety. Keep in mind that student advocacy and self-awareness and student voice are crucial to the development of a student with a learning disability. This is a lifelong disability, and our job as educators is to fill their backpack with strategies and teach them to use these strategies and advocate for what they need. So include the student in the discussions and ask them what works for them. With students with severe learning disabilities, we want to build a community of support, a wraparound sort of type approach, a whole child approach. So look at the child socially, emotionally, academically, cognitively, look at their race and their culture, their family, their mental health history. So what are their risk factors and what are their protective factors, and making sure that we're trying to build those up throughout their educational career. We often in education look through an asset-focused lens, but we must keep in mind that students with severe learning disabilities have a disability, and it's a recognized disability. And effort is necessary, but not sufficient to overcome their deficits. A lack of motivation is the result of, not the cause of, their academic failure. And the key to all relationships in teaching and working with children is building that relationship. So relationship, understanding what the student values and interests and what their culture is, recognizing and celebrating their strengths, and using a whole lot of empathy and reassurance. We always want to create a safe and accepting environment so the student feels that they can make mistakes and be accepted. And don't ever feel that you need to be the expert. Always reach out to your school and board personnel for assistance as you need it. So I'm just going to put my camera back on, and I don't know if there's any questions or comments. It doesn't look like there's anything in the Q&A room. I don't know, Emily, if you were able to see anything along the way.
It seems like there were some test stuff today, so I think we covered that earlier on.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I love talking about students with severe learning disabilities and connecting it to the psychological piece. So hopefully you learned something today. When we send you the slide deck and the recording, please feel free to share that widely. And our job is to support all of you within the boards with your students with severe learning disabilities. So the more you can share it and support amongst your colleagues, that's great. Please feel free to reach out to any of us at any time at the school with respects to applications or questions around students with learning disabilities. There is a link there at the bottom of this slide if you're interested in signing up for more webinars. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Take care.